It's your tour guide around the SWAC Sea Wells.
How long the tour bus, so let's go. Wednesday and Sunday out when you can take the tour.
Hop on now, we starting out. Texas land, the Panthers shout. Tigers roar in deserts drought. What's that whisper? Ain't no doubt. Next to Boot got Jags to see. More tigers prowling, making others flee. Arkansas, a quick short spree. Golden Lions, they run free.
Hop on the tour bus, so let's go. Wednesday and Sunday out when you can take the tour.
We love the sip, so we raising cheers. Delta doubles, fueling fears. Braves and Tigers through the years. Echo loud in crowded spheres. Swing through Bama, hear them call. Hornets buzzing, stand up tall. Bulldogs barking in the hall. Feel the rhythm break or fall. Sunshine State, we ending last. Rattlers creeping, moving fast. Join the chorus, make it blast. Wildcats past and future, hold it fast. SWAC stories on the stage. Every chapter turning page.
All right, everybody, what is going on? How y'all doing? Welcome to another edition of SWAC Talk, the show we cover the SWAC inside and out. Of course, I am your tour guide around the SWAC Sea Wells coming at you. And we're going to continue taking a look at some of the top returners for each team. Today, we're going to look at the running back position, and we're also going to dip our toe in the offensive line. You know, of course, it's a little bit tougher to figure out a lot of the line stuff because, you know, the stats and everything aren't there. And, you know, sometimes I got to use participation records and stuff. So we're going to take a look at that and tie those two things into each other. And also, we'll also just kind of take a look at what's what, and we'll do this throughout the summer, the spring. You know, we'll take a look at the returning receivers, then we'll do a defensive dive, and then we'll look at special teams and make our way through like that. So with that being said, man, y'all make sure y'all hit those socials: Facebook at Swag Talk, Instagram Swag Talk, Twitter Swag Talk 76. Also, don't forget to like the video, comment, and share your thoughts. And so we're going to go ahead and get into it, man. First off, I do want to thank everybody for helping us cross 1,400 subs. 1,500 is the next goal, man. So, and then up to 2,000. So we're going to continue to grow this page, man, and continue to do what we do. But we crossed 1,400, so I definitely appreciate that. And we'll be moving on up to 1,500 real soon. So let's go ahead and jump into this. We're going to start off with the Alabama A&M Bulldogs. They, of course, lost their top two rushers, Donovan Eaglin and Xavier Langford. Eaglin was actually the second leading rusher in the conference, so that's a big drop off there. Langford was the 24th rusher in the conference, so they lost two key guys there. This offense ran for 184 yards per game last season, which was third in the league. So they definitely were a team who wanted to run the ball, and they were very successful at that. Their leading returning rusher is Isaiah Nono. He's a redshirt junior. He played in 9 games last season, had 40 carries for 240 yards, no touchdowns. Also caught 3 passes for 34 yards and no touchdowns. The line returns a good bit of guys, man. They have six players who saw action last season. They returned 3 starters. They do lose a big piece of their offensive line. So they will have to replace Vincent, offensive line, but they returned quite a few guys, which definitely helps Coach Shade establish their run game. And like I said, this is a team that will run the ball. They like to run the ball. Last season, even with an offense that passed the ball quite frequently, they still ran the ball for 466 times which was fourth in the league. So I don't expect that number to drop a whole lot, especially with an offensive line that's established and can show that they can blow you off the ball. So I look forward to seeing them in action. And like I said, they, bringing in other guys to help with the running back room is also going to be a vital thing. But knowing that you got the guys up front that can open up those holes, you can put guys behind them to make plays a lot easier than you can put guys in front of talented backs and allow them to open up holes. So the Bulldogs are in a good position. They don't necessarily have the production returning, but they have the building blocks to have another solid rushing offense, especially with a staff that does want to run the football. So looking forward to seeing what they do there. Next is Alabama State, or the Hornets. Last season, they had a uptick in their run game last season. Actually finished fourth in the league with 169 yards per game, 12 touchdowns on the ground. Uh, they finished, like I said, they finished fourth in that in yards per game. They also ran the ball 460 times, which was also I think fifth in the league. So they were another team that was pretty run heavy. And knowing that you had a team that with short quarterbacks, you had to have a run game. And they lose their leading rusher in DeQuan Kinsey. He had 126 carries for 665 yards and 3 touchdowns. But they returned Jamari Holdsclaw, who missed time with an injury. Um, he actually played in 7 games this past season, rushing for 74 carries, 472 yards, and 1 touchdown. Also had 7 catches for 72 yards. This offensive line is experienced, especially in the starting unit. They, as far as my calculations, they return 4 guys who have started games on the offensive line. Obviously, building up depth and continuing to develop that unit is gonna be key. But this is a team who showed that they could run the ball last season, especially with adverse situations. So you whenever you're in those kind of positions and you got guys who are kind of making plays when plays haven't really been there. I think that gives you um, a better opportunity when things aren't as chaotic. And so having the offense move on the ground like that, when teams knew at times that you couldn't really run the ball, that you couldn't really throw the ball, I think that that definitely helps you. And Jamari Holdsclaw had a season high of 138 yards against FAMU earlier in the season, so he definitely was a guy who has the ability to break a break a big game. He also had 120 yards on the ground against Bethune Cookman. Um, so he definitely showed that he can have those games if he gets his hands on the ball. And so it's very vital for them to get him involved with an offense returning 2 starting caliber quarterbacks and some weapons at receiver. But I think this is a team that's gonna be um, in the mix in terms of being able to run the ball. Next is the Alcorn State Braves. They return Jacorian Sewell, who was a second team all conference rusher. He played in 11 games last season. He's a redshirt senior. He had 128 carries, 735 yards, 5 touchdowns. Also caught 9 passes for 41 yards. This offensive line that they had last season, they returned 7 guys who saw extensive action. And they played a lot of freshmen on that line. So they're definitely a group that's gonna have to continue to develop and grow. Um, Sewell was the fourth leading rusher on the seat in the conference last season with 67.3 yards per game. The Braves ran the ball 474 times, which was third in the league. They ran for over 197 yards per game and 26 touchdowns. They had a two-headed monster with Xavier Vaughn also running the ball from the quarterback spot. But this is a team that definitely they ran the ball extremely well. The rest of the offense didn't necessarily go the way that they wanted to with their passing attack, but they ran the ball extremely well, especially for a team that most people knew they were going to run the ball. they only threw the ball 309 times last season, which was the third fewest. So you knew Alcorn was going to run the football, and they did a good job with that. And obviously, having capable runners is going to make that easier. But the line, they had their ups and downs, and they did develop some experience. So having them continue to grow and come together is definitely going to be a vital factor. I think you looking at them at the tackle slots is going to be a spot that they're going to want to improve on. But Sewell, like I said, he was a big time ball carrier for the Braves last season. Didn't necessarily have a ton of huge games individually. He had 122 yards against Jackson State in their final game of the season. But he was a guy who was steady and could make he could make those big runs. And having a guy next to Xavier Vaughn definitely made things a lot easier for them to move the ball on the ground. So we look at him as being able to carry the load in that aspect, and I expect to see him continue to do that, especially with a team who is gonna have a new starting quarterback, and that's definitely gonna have a guy that can help you with that. It is definitely a key factor to your offense. So we'll look forward to seeing him do what he do. Moving on to a guy who was kind of a surprise last season, came on stronger in the middle to late portions of the season, and that's Bethune Cookman's Dennis Palmer. Now the Wildcats as a whole did not run the ball well at all. They ran the ball 420 times for 1,265 yards, only averaged 3 yards per carry. They had 12 touchdowns on the ground, 105 yards per game. That number was 11th in the league. So they did not run the ball well as a unit, but individually, Dennis Palmer had a really good season, especially later in the season. He played in 9 games last season, had 159 attempts, 706 yards, 5 touchdowns, averaged 4.4 yards per carry, averaged 78.4 yards per game. He was third in the league in yards per game on the ground. So he definitely was a guy who was a huge factor in his offense. Like I said, especially in the later portions of the season. He also caught 8 passes for 60 yards. Uh, just a guy who, he's a sophomore, so he came on as a freshman, and kind of took that position by the reins and really had a great end of his season. Um, Team wise, not necessarily a great games there, but he had 178 yards against FAMU, which was um, the third highest rushing performance by any running back in the conference last season. Um, Other than that, not necessarily a ton of huge numbers games, but just a guy that was really steady. When you got an offense that not really doing a lot, he showed that he could carry the ball. He ran the ball 20 times against Grambling. He had 19 carries against Southern. Um, he had a season high 30. He had a SWAC season high 37 carries against FAMU. So he definitely was able to carry the ball a lot. And that's a guy that you look forward to seeing him in action. I'm honestly surprised that they held on to him, because guys have success and they leave, but he stuck around. So we'll see if he can continue to get better. Um, he also was a second team all conference running back. Their offensive line was young. They return over 10. They have 10 plus returners coming back. This offensive line is going to have to play better. They really struggled at times offensively. Even with an offense that was okay passing the ball, they still had a lot of issues with the offensive line and just protection and opening up holes. They gave up 31 sacks, and they when you give up a lot of sacks, you're also going to give up a lot of tackles for loss. So, like I said, this defensive line and this offensive line, really had their struggles. But having a young group that comes back and able to put together another season together, I think that helps you. That helps you a lot. Um, Now, the one thing is, will guys continue to buy in when things not going right? That's always going to be my concern with teams that are struggling. Are these guys being put in good positions? Are they able to develop and get better as the season goes on? Or are they looking for ways out? Um, we'll continue to see because, like I said, numerically as a whole, this team did not do good on the ground. But when you got a back that was capable of making plays, that definitely changes a lot of things with your offense. So if they can mold that group together and they have a lot of guys that they can mold into it and they have a lot of guys that played last season, if they can mold that group together, um, that definitely can help this team get better with the run game. And in the SWAC, you definitely have to run the ball. I mean, when you look at the teams, um, mainly if you look at the bottom 5 or 6 teams in the conference, from 8 to 12, um, all those teams had basically losing records in conference. So, and none of those teams ran for over 115 yards per game. So you have to run for over 140 plus to give yourself opportunity to have any kind of success in conference. Yes, you could throw it around, but there's a point in the game where you need to be able to run the ball, whether that's a drain clock or short yardage. So that's definitely a factor. So I love to see Bethune-Cookman get a little bit better at running the football, but they have a guy who can get the job done when you put the ball in his hands. Next up are the Rattlers of FAMU. They return one of the better backs in the league, Thad Franklin. He's a senior. Yeah, 12 games, action, 120 carries, 653 yards, 5 touchdowns. He also was the best receiving running back in the conference returning. He caught 19 passes, 162 yards, and 2 touchdowns. This is a guy I think can be an all-conference preseason guy. I think between Franklin, Palmer, and Sewell, and you can probably throw in Holesclaw, whether people look at his production and not necessarily just hold him missing games. Um, and maybe even Terrell from Jackson State. I think those guys are gonna be you can pick out of those guys to be your 4 all conference running backs for the preseason. So I do think there are some solid backs in on this list returning, but there's also a lot of unknowns returning as well. So it's kind of a mixed bag when you look at the returning production and teams who don't return a lot of production. So it's kind of a mix. And Franklin is definitely a guy that's one of the top guys returning. They have a solid offensive line. They're losing some key starters, but they're also returning some guys that saw extensive action. And FAMU is always going to be pretty strong on that offensive line. Last season, their running game got going a little bit late, but they were able to finish 7th in the league in rushing at 145 yards per game. Only 8 touchdowns. It took them a while to get in the end zone on the ground, but they ran the ball extremely well with that 3-headed monster they had. And so, they committed to the run later in the season. I think if they commit to the run more early this season, that's going to help them a lot. They did average 4.7 yards per carry when they did run the ball, which is third in the league, which was tied for third in the league. And they ran for a conference low 367 carries, so they didn't even run the ball a lot. But when they did find some success. And, Franklin was a big part of that. And that's a guy who I expect to see have those big games. He had 195 yards in the Florida Classic against Bethune-Cookman. So definitely showed that, when you do give him the carries, he can be productive. Um, he ran the ball 26 times in that game, so they definitely fed him. And when you feed a guy like that, and he shows that he can make it happen and continue to do it, he'll have those opportunities to get those carries and get those big plays there. So I like I said, that's a guy who I would throw into my top group of returning backs. And honestly, there's not a lot of other guys after this that I would consider in that group. There's one more, but after that, we have Dedrick Talbert from Grambling. He's a grad student Didn't, saw action 11 games, didn't really get a lot of production, but he finished with 54 carries for 208 yards, had four touchdowns, um, four catches for 22 yards. Their offensive line was also full of freshmen, and that's to be expected with a new coach at that time. They returned eight plus guys that have saw action on the offensive line. They losing some big time backs. Grambling didn't necessarily have a rushing attack that you would expect um, with uh, um, with the backs that they had. I thought having guys like they had, um, you could have had a better rushing attack, but they finished 10th at 111 yards per game. They ran about 406 times, which was I think the third fewest. They averaged 3.3 yards per carry, which was the fourth worst. Um, just wasn't a lot there, for this team offensively as a whole. They just did not have a great season in the air or on the ground. And with the like I said, with the weapons they had, that's kind of a disappointment. But um, they have a young stable of backs that they're gonna try to get carries for. But Talbot is a guy that, like I say, he's been around a long time, and when he saw action, he's been able to make some plays here and there. So um, he's a guy that I don't know if he'll be a every down guy, but he definitely can be a valuable piece to this offense, especially with a group of younger backs behind him. So I do expect him to get a good bit of carries early, especially as those younger guys develop. I would expect to see him get a lot of carries in those first few games, and then they kind of go from there. But like I said, this is another team with a young offensive line that had to play a lot of freshmen, and so we'll see if they can get better because they did have their ups and downs, and that's something that they're definitely gonna have to work on and improve. Just if these guys who are behind them want to put up solid numbers. Next is Jackson State, and they return Travis Terrell, who was a more of a all-purpose type of guy, all first team, all conference return specialist. Definitely a very, very dangerous weapon in the return game. Um, a guy who could honestly swing a game by itself with his return skills. And he led the league in kick returns with 551 yards. He had two kickoff return touchdowns, had a longer 96. He led the league in punt returns, averaging 16.7 yards per return, with a longer 44. And then when you throw in his rushing yardage, he ran the ball for 459 yards on 75 carries, played in 13 games. He is a sophomore. He had four touchdowns. He also caught 15 passes for 95 yards. So um, you're looking at a guy with You're looking at a guy with over like 1,400 yards of total offense. That's a very valuable weapon, and that's why I feel like he could potentially be a preseason All Conference back, but he definitely will be the preseason All Conference returner. And he's a guy who can make big plays. I mean, if he touches the ball, he's gonna break it a lot of times. Um, I look at um I look at Jackson State as a group that is deep at the running back spot, and you throw in your quarterbacks who can carry the ball, and so they don't necessarily have to lean on one guy to do it. They're losing Irv Mulligan, but you're returning a lot of other guys that can carry the ball. A couple backs that were out last season are back, so this is a unit that is gonna they're going to have a lot of success running the football because they have a lot of valuable pieces that can run the ball. And Terrell was 16th in the league in rushing yards per game. Um, this team actually led the conference in rushing with 213 yards, 33 touchdowns. They averaged 5.2 yards per carry, almost 3,000 yards on the ground. They ran the ball 571 times, so they weren't shy about running the ball, and I don't expect that to be any different. Um, they were a run first team, and they did throw the ball when they needed to, but they were a run first team, and I don't expect that to change too much. And this is a guy who could be to me more of a change of pace type of guy. I wouldn't necessarily see him as your every down guy, but he's definitely a guy that if you put the ball in his hands, anyone on the field he's gonna break it, and that's a very very valuable weapon for anybody's offense, and that's what makes him the top all-purpose guy on this list. Um, and probably the most dangerous guy on this list. And he is honestly at this point of the list probably the last true star type guy on this list. We have a lot of other guys coming back who didn't really have a lot of production, but are capable making plays when they had the opportunity. Next up is Valley and the Delta Devils. They lose they lose a lot of their rushing. They lose the Fabian Fant. They lose Jacoby Thomas. They lose um, Tajarian Williams, who actually led the team in rushing at the quarterback spot. And that takes us down to Zamarion Kendall. He's a junior. He had 10 carries on the 16. He played the 10 games, had 46 carries, 67 yards, no touchdowns. Also caught 2 passes for 17 yards. Um, Everything's open for this team. You know, this team, new Coach Buckley. Um, they're losing a lot. They don't necessarily have a lot in terms of numbers and depth. They did return a few guys from a really young offensive line, but I feel like with a new coach, there's gonna be a lot of new faces on this unit. So it's really tough to peg them anywhere. They finished last in the league in rushing at 86 yards per game. They averaged 2.5 yards per carry, which was last in the league. They had 1,035 yards on the season, which obviously was last. They ran the ball 414 times, which was ninth in the league. So, and they finished with 12 touchdowns on the ground. So, not a really good productive unit. But this team as a whole didn't really do a lot offensively. So, you can only get what you can only get what you can get from a unit that's not going to really give you a whole lot. And so this to me is a clean slate. So not really going to put too much stock into anything right now because we have no idea where this team will be and who their guys will be. And so I'm just kind of using this as a holding pattern till we get to a better position to figure out who the Delta Devils are and what their philosophies would be. Next up is Prairie View, and they return Connor Wisham, uh, a guy who I had really high hopes for coming into college. Didn't necessarily able to break out because he's been behind a lot of good backs his time at Prairie View. This could be the season that he takes that lead role, but he finished with nine games of action, 76 carries, 249 yards, had 2 touchdowns. Also had 39 yards on 6 receptions. They returned 7 guys or more who did see some extensive action on the offensive line. So there is some there is some there is some continuity there. And they also have a new coach too, Coach Jackson. So I expect to see some change there. So again, like I said, with Valley, new coach, new faces. The Panthers didn't necessarily have a great running game this season even with the capable backs they had. They only ran the ball for 113 yards on the season, which was ninth in the league. They had 11 touchdowns, which was actually the second fewest in the league, I believe. Um, they ran for 3.2 yards per carry, which was the third worst. They finished with 1,364 yards, which was the fourth worst. And they did run the ball up. They ran the ball a decent amount. Ran about 425 times on the season, which was 6. So they did try to run the ball. They just didn't really have a lot of success when they did it. And so, I expect that to change because, having a new coach, I think he's going to want to establish that ground game. And so, we'll see, what guys step into that realm and make things happen. But right now, Wisham is the guy. Like I said, he's shown flashes. I mean, he is a senior at this point, and that's crazy to me because I saw this kid play in high school, and I saw him go to Purview, and I really thought he would break out almost immediately there, but hadn't really had that opportunity playing behind some of the backs Purview had in previous seasons. So this could be the year that he takes the reins and runs with it. So we'll see what happens there. Next up is probably the most inexperienced running back room in the conference, and that's Southern. They lose basically all of their top rushers. They lose their top three backs. They even with quarterbacks having low rushing yardage, they lose a couple of those guys. So you have to go down to Barry Remo, who again is a young kid. He's only a sophomore this season. As a true freshman last season, he did play in 9 games. He had 10 carries for 27 yards and 2 touchdowns. He had 1 catch for 4 yards on the season. He was primarily used as a short yardage guy. Didn't like I said, didn't really get a lot of action in terms of carries, but he did get on the field a good bit. Um, this is going to be a really young unit, and I wouldn't be surprised if this was one of those units that added a guy out of the portal, an experienced guy, because basically the three backs that played in the spring, I think two were sophomores and one was a freshman, or so they, a really young group, and then you throw this guy Remo in, who did not play in the spring game, but he's also a sophomore. So, that's four guys that are very young. So I wouldn't be surprised to see this unit add a veteran back or two in that rotation. Um, Southern started the season slow running the ball. They had a lot of offensive line issues. They made some personnel changes, and the offensive line got a lot better, and the running game got a lot better. And this unit returns 10 plus guys that have saw action, including 3 or 4 starters returning. So this is one of the more experienced lines in the conference, and like say a group that started to gel in the mid portion of the season after they made a few changes. Southern finished fifth in rushing at 156 yards per game. They finished with 16 touchdowns. They averaged 4.1 yards per carry. They ran the ball a ton last season. They had 494 attempts, which was second in the league. So they definitely ran the ball a lot. They ran for over 2,000 yards on the season. And, for a team who offensively was kind of up and down, um, they did finish fourth in passing offense in terms of yards per game. So, this was not an offense as bad as a lot of people thought it was. They just weren't consistent. But the running game was probably the big factor, especially later in the season. And now with so many young guys there, you're gonna definitely have your growing pains. So that's why I think if there was any unit that I would put a big question mark on Southern right now, it would be the running backs, because there's just not any experience there. And so we'll see how they handle it. Next up is Texas Southern. They lose their top rusher on the season in Quintrell Quinn, who actually was one of the top backs in the league in terms of yards per game at 65.1 yards per game, which was fifth. So they're losing a big portion of their offense there. They do return Athian Renfro. This I call this guy a bowling ball, man. He's like 5'10", 225 or something like that. Not a little. He looks stockier than he is probably, but he's a tough guy to bring down. He finished with 72 carries for 323 yards and 11 touchdowns, 11 games with 4 touchdowns on the season. Also had 1 catch for -7 yards. Another team that had a younger offensive line. I didn't really see a lot of guys on their participation records from games. So the few guys I did see, they did return 4 of those guys that saw action. So this is another young offensive line. Of course, Coach Dishman is in his second year, so they're still putting some things together. But this was an offense that really, they were run heavy when you look at them as a team, because they definitely did not have a really solid passing attack. They ran about 417 times on the season, which was the fifth most. They ran for 147 yards per game, and they had 18 touchdowns. They also averaged 3.9 yards per carry. And they had to run the ball because they were one of the worst passing teams in the conference at 117 yards per game. Uh, that's really rough. And they threw the ball 232 times, which was the second fewest. So they didn't really attempt a lot of passes. They threw the fewest touchdowns. They threw the second fewest touchdowns on the season. And so they really were a team that had to run the football. And most people knew that. but they were able to be successful to some extent. And so I look at this team as, who's gonna be the guy for this offense. I think Renfro is a guy who can help that. I don't know if he's an every down guy. Like a lot of these guys may not be every down guys, but I think he can make some things happen. Um, he did have 129 yards against Bethune-Cookman in their second to last game, so he does have the ability to have a solid, have some really productive games. Um, and that's why I look at it like maybe he can be that guy if they, if they thrust him in that role, or it can be somebody else. But I think he's a guy that's definitely going to get you those tough yards, and so I really look at him as being able to make that happen. He ran the ball 22 times in that game, so he also shows that he can handle a good workload running the ball. And so I expect to see if he gets that action to kind of continue to develop and get better um, as this time moves on. And finally, with Pine Bluff, we have BJ Curry. Pine Bluff offensively, especially in their running game last season, was really they were really hampered by injuries. And other spots on the team got injuries, so they had to move guys from the running back position to the linebacker position and things like that. So Curry definitely he had a pretty good season at times. This was another team that was kind of one dimensional in a sense. They were a team who really threw the ball pretty well last season, um, finishing. They finished third in the league in passing at 219 yards per game. So that definitely was what they did. They threw the ball 347 times um, compared to 373 carries. So they did run the ball more than they threw it, but their running game was not very productive. 115 yards per game on the season, 3.7 yards per carry. Like I said, they made their hay through the air, and that's where their identity was. But they ran the ball a lot. They just didn't really have a lot there. But Curry, like I said, he had a solid season running the ball. He played in 12 games. He's a junior. He had 123 carries for 509 yards, had 4 touchdowns. He also caught 13 passes for 199 yards on the season, including an 85-yard reception on one of the craziest plays I ever saw against Southern. So he definitely is a guy that he can do a little bit of everything for you. And he's a guy who showed the ability to be a solid rusher. Um, Finished 12th in the league in rushing at this point with 42.4 yards per game. So definitely a guy who made the most of his opportunity. Um, Again, Pine Bluff, their issue on both sides of the ball has been the offensive line. They returned I think 4 guys that I saw action from their participation records. Um, another young offensive line, and when you have these new coaches, and I mean Coach Hampton's moving into his 3rd year, but when you have these groups that's not able to put together um, a strong offensive line, especially experienced, when you're gonna constantly have those young groups, and that's where they are right now, and that's where they've been. They are working to fix that, but finding those guys is always tough. Um, and now you have another an offensive unit that's going to be starting a different quarterback this season. You're losing your top receiver. You do return a couple guys, but there's so much flux on this offense um, in all positions. So we don't really know what his team is going to be. But BJ Curry is a solid cornerstone if you want to kind of put some things around him and maybe feature him. He did carry the ball 25 times against Pine Bluff. Against Texas Southern. So he is a guy who can carry it, can carry a good workload. But I don't expect to see that many carries from him in most games. Um, and that's why I say this is like a mixed bag of groups. I think a couple years ago I did a video that I said like what I think it was 2021. I mean 22 or 23. was the year of the running back because there were a lot of big time backs coming back. This season is I wouldn't necessarily say is not a bad group because there is some legitimate potential star power at the top of the group. When you look at Franklin, you look at Terrell, you look at Sewell, Holesclaw, Got Palmer. Those guys are guys I think are potential stars in this league. And then you have another group of teams with a guy like maybe Curry and Isaiah Nono. Those are second level type guys. And then everybody else, even Connor Wisham, you could throw him in there if he gets the carries. And then everybody else is kind of, it just depends. So I do think this is a decent group of returning rushers. It's not the greatest, but it's not the worst either. Like I said, the top is really strong. And that, that's saying a lot for a season where you're losing your top two rushers in conference. Your two guys who either ran for 1,000 yards or nearly 1,000 yards, but you return two of your top five rushers. Let's put it that way, and three of your top 10. So there are some very productive guys in the top 10. If you go down to if you stretch it out to the top 15, you got four of the top 15. So there are some guys who have made some things happen. And even if you stretch it out to your top 20, you got 6 of the top 20 returning. So there is some guys who have had good seasons coming back. And there's a mix of production. There's guys who have really high numbers. There's guys who have middle of the pack numbers. But six of the 12 teams return a guy who finished in the top 20 in rushing. And then even if you throw in a guy like Wisham and Nono from Bama A&M, that's another two guys who were 23rd and 25th. So eight other top 25 rushers in the conference come back. So that basically means 4 teams out of the 12 don't have a guy returning that was in the top 25 of the top 25 in rushing. And Holesclaw probably would have been in there if he played more games, but he went down to injury. So that you can, if you throw him in there because his numbers would have put him like he finished with 472 yards. That will put him 16th. So that's another top 20 guy. So potentially 9 out of the top 25 return. Not only leave 3 teams with guys who did not finish anywhere near the top 25, although a couple of those guys didn't really have a lot of action. So that's impressive. So that means there are some very capable backs in this league. And I think when you look at it that way, there are a lot of really good backs, and I think the running back position may be the strongest so far that we've covered. We'll see how the receiver core stacks up, and that'll be our next video. I'm not sure if I'm going to drop that on Wednesday or Saturday or Sunday. I'm not sure yet, but there's a bigger drop off in terms of returning guys at that position just from first glance. And I'm going to include tight ends in that group too. So that'll make that a little bit more interesting. But the running back position is actually pretty strong. And I'm looking at it deeper, I think there's a lot of guys who can really be successful this season. So the state of the running back position, I think, is a lot better than the state of the quarterback position right now. And that's pretty much where we stand. So with that being said, man, I'm your tour guide around the SWAC, C. Wells, signing out, and I will catch y'all on the rebound. Peace.